Welcome to Mortal Giants. I'm Sandy Garossino.
And I'm Vina Nadjibulla.
And this podcast is produced in collaboration with Canada's National Observer.
Ukraine says it has now fired on new combatants.
Episode 6, Strange Bedfellows, Russia, North Korea, and the war in Ukraine.
Russia's deadly attacks on Ukraine continue, and with both sides strained after years of war, a new enemy may be marshalling against Kyiv.
There is evidence that there are DPRK troops, in Russia.
U.S. leaders calling on China to use their influence to prevent escalation between Russia and Ukraine.
Hi, Vina. It's so great to be back together again, looking at how the world's unfolding. It's been a while.
It has been a while, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation, Sandy.
Yeah, so today, we're always looking at what's happening in the different theaters around the world, the global dynamics that are happening, and most recently, we've seen the news. A new chapter has unfolded in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is that Russia has now reached some sort of agreement with North Korea and is bringing in North Korean troops, and the extent of that cooperation is not fully known. But Vina, tell us what is happening between Russia and Kim Jong-un and North Korea with regard to the Ukraine war.
We have entered a new chapter in this war of aggression that Russia began in February of 2022. You're absolutely right. We now have the U.S. government confirming that there are 10,000 North Korean troops in Russia, and about 8,000 of them are in the Kursk Oblast on the border with Ukraine. We initially heard about this from various intelligence sources of South Korea and Ukraine, and there have been different numbers floated around there, but I'm going to go with the Pentagon numbers and State Department numbers, which is 10,000 and then 8,000. This is a huge development. It's a huge escalation, and there are many dimensions to this, so I think we should unpack sort of why North Korea is doing this, because North Korea hasn't deployed troops anywhere outside of its borders since the Korean War. Russia also hasn't invited any foreign troops for more than 100 years. So this is a huge deal.
This is really remarkable, as you describe, on both fronts. Number one, in some ways, it's almost revolutionary turn of events for North Korea, which has been it hasn't been quiet.
Another milestone in North Korea's missile development, setting a record with the launch of what South Korean and Japanese officials believe could be a new type of solid-fuel intercontinental ballistic missile. It reached a record-breaking altitude of 7,000 kilometers.
It's been isolated and closed off.
It's been isolated and closed off, but we've been seeing with the missile tests going on, with increasing aggression, increasing kind of jangling of its neighbors in the Asia Pacific, but it has been entirely closed off. It's almost like a black hole of a state, and now, boom, we're seeing something new.
They have joined Russia's campaign in Europe, which is thousands of kilometers away.
What's North Korea's calculation here?
And we have to go back to the June trip that President Putin took to North Korea. At that point, North Korea and Russia revived a Cold War defense agreement, a mutual security agreement, and we've seen a lot more cooperation between North Korea and Russia. North Korea has already been supplying Russia with much needed munition and even missiles, and of course, Russia has been giving North Korea money, food, and fuel. So the two countries have already been really strengthening their security cooperation, their trade cooperation. There's a lot of activity happening on the border between North Korea and Russia from everything that we're seeing, including through publicly available satellite images. In the past, North Korea had been exclusively dependent on China. So China basically was the main economic partner, main security partner for North Korea. Recently, North Korea has been broadening its relationships with Russia. And then Russia, of course, is also broadening its relationship with Iran. So you're kind of seeing this partnership. Some have called it an axis of upheaval between Russia, Iran, North Korea, and to some extent China. China is a slightly different actor, whereas Russia, North Korea, and Iran are overtly hostile, are overtly anti-West in this kind of war of different types and different fronts. China is playing a bit of a double-faced diplomacy. It's still trying to maintain a facade of being neutral in the Ukraine war, partly because it doesn't want to lose relations with Europe, important trading relationships. China also doesn't want the Korean peninsula to be too destabilized because it has strong economic relations with South Korea. So to the extent that it obviously has been North Korea's only patron and a lifeline for 60 years, it's done so in a very strategic way, sort of like a very calibrated way. China gives North Korea a little bit, but not too much. Whereas now we are seeing Russia, which is a much more unpredictable actor. And the big question mark for everybody, Sandy, is in addition to financing fuel and food, will Putin also give North Korea sensitive military technology, which would be a game changer on the Korean peninsula, meaning that it would allow North Korea to finally make massive advances in its nuclear program, as well as its missile delivery program. And you've referenced the ICBM test just of last week. These are all concerning signs. And even China, I think, would be quite reticent about that kind of an escalation on the Korean peninsula and that kind of a breakthrough for North Korea.
Can you just give us a geography lesson? Because
Sure.
you talked about the North Korean, the border with Russia.
North Korea does have an actual land border with Russia, and it has been an important lifeline to it. And we're seeing a lot of these troops that have been now deployed all the way to the European side of Russia, initially enter through the Far East and training in the Far East. So the 2,000 that now still remain are in the Far East, and then the 8,000 have been moved by train all the way to the border with Ukraine, to the Kursk Oblast. And initially, Russians tried to pretend that these troops were actually Siberians, that they were Russians, because they're dressed up in Russian uniform, right? So the North Koreans now in the Kursk Oblast are in Russian uniform. They are, like I said, initially there was a bit of a pretense that this was not North Korean troops and in fact Far Eastern Russians of various ethnic minorities that would look in the similar way. So Russia and North Korea have had a really complicated, long-standing relationship. What's interesting about this particular moment is also that in the past, Russia has been the big brother to North Korea. Russia has always helped North Korea. Now it's North Korea, this much smaller state, that is quote-unquote rescuing Putin and offering him a lifeline in its fight against the Ukraine. I mean, 10,000 troops may not seem like a lot, but it is a good number to deal especially with the Kursk situation, because Russia has been unable to push back Ukrainian incursion into Kursk that began earlier this year. It has been an irritant for Putin because he doesn't want to redirect troops that are in the front lines inside Ukraine.
He doesn't want to move his own troops. So
Right.
This is, in a way, it's like Lego blocks of
It's giving him a lifeline inside Russian territory, right? So like Ukrainian troops are now inside
occupying
Russian territory.
Exactly. And this will help them
And
push
the Korean
back.
troops could help. But like I said, for North Korea, this is a massive ego boost, especially for the regime, right, which has always been dependent on Russia and China. Now it's kind of doing something to support Russia, the big brother. It's also a big strategic thing for North Korea because it's basically a down payment on what they hope would be then a Russian assistance to them with military technology and much needed sort of advancements for its bigger program.
There's an interesting article in Financial Times in the last, a column by Gideon Rachman saying that the West underestimates North Korea at its peril, and talking about North Korea's military ambitions in the Pacific, but not only in the Pacific, actually potentially confronting even the United States. Is the idea that this would be a confrontation of the United States military strength in the Asia Pacific because it has all those bases there, or are we talking about a direct confrontation of the U.S.?
I mean, there's a lot in what you asked, but maybe it would be helpful to kind of think through what has happened over the last few years. After former President Trump's kind of unsuccessful diplomacy with North Korea, in the last few years, and certainly under the Biden administration, I think we the West haven't really figured out what to do with North Korea. There really hasn't been that much. There's been no effort to deal with them. I mean, I think...
Can I just, I just want to jump in and ask, you talk about Trump's unsuccessful
Yes.
diplomacy with North Korea. Let's just rewind that tape a little bit. What made it unsuccessful? I mean,
Well,
it surprised the world, but...
I mean, like, President Trump wasn't as good of a diplomat as he may have thought, right? I mean, he thought that he could essentially do something that many other former U.S. leaders were unable to do, which is to make a deal with the North Korean regime. And everything fell through because it didn't make sense. I mean, North Korea ultimately wants to be recognized as a nuclear state. It wants to start from that position that, yes, it wants to be reintegrated into the world order potentially, but as a nuclear state. That's a non-starter for South Korea, right? I mean, South Korea cannot live in a world in which it's completely normalized for North Korea to be a nuclear state. And like I said, we are now in a situation where there isn't much of a game plan to deal with North Korea, right? We've kind of just been in a frozen state. There's not much diplomacy. It's been largely an issue that South Korea had to deal with in terms of its own diplomatic ambitions. But now, with this war in Ukraine, Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, and North Korea playing a much more important role in that, things are changing. Because, like I said, the big question is, what is Russia going to give North Korea in return? And what would that mean on the dynamics on the peninsula?
Yes.
What is worrying as well, we're seeing that the regime in DPRK is now also saying that it no longer believes in reunification with South Korea. It has, in fact, labeled South Korea an enemy state.
South Korea's military says it is, quote, fully ready to respond after North Korea ordered troops on the border to prepare to fire.
That's one of the things that I wanted to
And that's
talk
significant,
about,
right?
because this is really destabilizing.
Or it's signaling a different future, right?
Yes.
It's essentially saying, no, there would not be reunification on their terms, right? Like each side basically wants reunification, but for
Its
South
own
Korea
terms.
under democratic rule and for North Korea under the authoritarian rule. But now North Korea is saying no unification, South Korea is an enemy state. Kim Jong-un is physically destroying bridges and infrastructure that's connecting the two states. And he's continuously testing more and more sophisticated ICBMs. The last test, flew the longest, 86 minutes, the highest in terms of 7,000 kilometers. So they are getting more sophisticated with their military capabilities. And that is, of course, very worrying for South Korea. If you think about the broader dynamics within the Indo-Pacific, you have the United States, Japan, Taiwan, Australia very squarely in this kind of posture of deterring and balancing against China, viewing China as a revisionist state, a state that is trying to reclaim certain territories within South China Sea, but also Taiwan. Whereas South Korea, while obviously being a democratic ally of the U.S., has always been a little bit more careful because its primary preoccupation had been the Korean Peninsula. And it didn't want to alienate China too much because of China's leverage over North Korea. If North Korea now goes full-on aggressive, and if North Korea engages in a war against NATO, that makes the strategic calculations for South Korea very different and could potentially actually strengthen South Korea's alliance and relationship with Japan and the U.S. and others, which is something that China doesn't want, right? So this is why it all gets really complicated in terms of the various calculations of actors in the region.
So how do you read China is going to view this new adventurism by North Korea?
Yeah, I mean, China doesn't like it, but it doesn't want to say anything publicly because it doesn't want to undermine Putin, and it also doesn't want to necessarily sort of show its displeasure and out of alignment with North Korea and Putin's actions. But I think in an ideal world, China doesn't want this level of instability on the Korean Peninsula, potentially, because like I said, it will lead South Korea further away, and it would also complicate its relationship, China's relationship with Europe. But on the other hand, let's not confuse a couple of things. One is that once the war began, once Putin started this war in Ukraine, China doesn't want Putin to lose, which is why it's supporting him with everything short of lethal weapons because of sanctions.
Why doesn't China want Putin to lose?
Because Putin is China's strategic partner, because Putin and Xi are basically soulmates when it comes to their belief that the U.S. is an evil empire and the world needs to be reordered, with the U.S. in a much more diminished position. So like at the strategic level, Xi and Putin are aligned. Putin and certainly North Korea sometimes go about things in a much more destabilizing way that makes China nervous. China would like to do things in a little bit more sort of a gray zone version of things, right? Short of war, short of open aggression, because they feel like that advances their interests better, because their interests are much more interconnected with Western Europe and the global economy, right? China has more at stake. China needs Europe right now. China needs stability with the US. Whereas Russia and North Korea are much more, they have less at stake, or they feel like they're already fully in this existential fight.
Just as Russia's invasion of Ukraine has revitalized cooperation and cohesion among the NATO allies, it's also spurred a lot more cohesion among Russia and its backers. Welcome to our panel on the axis of upheaval.
I just want to explore a little bit about, in Foreign Affairs, there's a recent article talking about what you've described as the axis of upheaval, China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia, and how they perceive the U.S. is in a period of decline. It has reached its zenith and it's now in structural decline. This is at the same time as the U.S. economy is charging way ahead of other economies in the world.
Certainly China's.
So its economic strength is at the moment unchallenged. But clearly, you know, we're just recording just before the U.S. election, and regardless of the outcome of that election, the whole democracy project in the United States and in the West is under attack through forces that are weakening all its institutions. So how do these powers, when they say that they see the West in decline, what are they seeing, and how is it in their interest if the American economy go south in a big way? Because that's their big market, or China's big market.
In the same way that China's views on what's happening between North Korea and Russia are complex and multiple things can be true at the same time, the same is also true here. Countries like China and Russia and everybody in the BRICS, right, like Brazil, India, China, Russia, they all believe that relatively speaking, the West is in decline, meaning that proportionally, the West is now less than 50% of the world's economy, whereas before it was up to 75%. It's all about relative power. You're absolutely right that the U.S. economy has been remarkable in its post-COVID recovery. In fact, it has surprised everyone, and it is the most dynamic economy in the world right now when it comes to innovation and research and development, AI, and all of that. But on the sort of, if you look at the global balance of power, you now have others who are contesting U.S.'s preeminence or hegemony. Because after the end of the Cold War, we entered this unique period where U.S. was the sole superpower, and it was dominant. We were in a unipolar moment. Now we are no longer in that world, and something else is emerging. It's not yet fully multipolar, but you have others who have power. U.S. is not the only actor, together with its Western allies, who can make things in the world. As we are seeing, if that were true, we wouldn't be in the mess that we are in Ukraine and in the Middle East, right? So U.S. power is now limited. That's what they mean. That's what Xi Jinping means when he says that the East is rising and the West is in decline. I think he's overestimating that, and I think certainly that may have looked true the first year of COVID. It's not looking as true or as relevant right now. Things are a little bit more complicated, but there are also serious constraints on U.S. power, both internationally, but also domestically, as you pointed out. A lot of populism, polarization, protectionism. U.S. is no longer able to offer the world, especially Southeast Asia, for instance, or the Indo-Pacific, the kind of trade structures or agreements or opportunities as it could even 20 years ago because of protectionism.
That stability is really gone. And in fact, in Europe, too, like a belief that America is going to be this stalwart NATO partner and that these alliances can be relied on not only for the next 10 years, but for next year. That kind of certainty has really eroded. So just looking at facts on the ground, what you're seeing, if you were to make a guess as to where Putin and Kim Jong-un will go with this new form of alliance, if you were to look into your crystal ball and say, in a year, in 2 years, this is what I see, and this is how this is going to impact Ukraine, Europe, the Asia Pacific, and the Korean Peninsula. Give us a quick summary
It's never
picture.
it's never a good thing to be guessing into the future, but I think
it's all we can do.
Yeah, but I think a couple of things will be true. I mean, I think the relationship between North Korea and Russia will be stronger and deeper. We'll see greater cooperation at all levels. I think the realization in the West and more generally about the interconnectedness of the North Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific would also be deeper and better understood. And I think countries like South Korea will deepen their partnership with NATO countries as well as among themselves. So the U.S., Japan, South Korea partnerships, as well as the Asia-Pacific Four and NATO will be deeper as a result of this. Beyond that, a lot will depend on what are some of the other dynamics with respect to how quickly things both in the Middle East and in Ukraine. We now have these two open theaters and a lot of tension in the Indo-Pacific. I think 2025 will be a deciding year with respect to these two conflicts. I think there's a lot of momentum to try to bring some kind of a peace process in Ukraine. People are preparing for that. But with respect to Russia, Putin is determined to continue to survive and outlast the West. We are seeing that. I found it really concerning watching this last BRICS meeting in Russia in Kazan. Not because of what Putin said or what Xi Jinping said, but because the UN Secretary General chose to go. He actually was there and chose to be there, make speeches, shake hands with Putin. This is a really concerning development. I mean, I understand that Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, but did he really
out of
need
the
to
wheelhouse
go there?
of the UN to go and be part of
something like this, right? So, I think, unfortunately, more than 2 years into his war of aggression, Putin has not been isolated. His economy has not crumbled. He's continuing to wage his war. He now has support from North Korea. He has support from Iran. He continues to have support from China in very meaningful ways. China is enabling Russia to fight this war, and our sanctions have not really had the desired impact. So there's some serious questions that we now need to face as we enter 2025.
And an uncertain future, an uncertain era ahead of us. Vina Nadjibulla, thank you again so much for a wonderful overview.
Thank you, Sandy. Always great to speak with you.
This has been a Teeny Turner production in collaboration with Canada's National Observer. It was researched, written, hosted, and produced by me, Sandy Garossino, and Eric Chapman. Editing, sound design, and engineering by Eric Chapman, with special thanks to Sandra Bartlett and Linda Solomon of Canada's National Observer. Please subscribe and share on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Tell your friends and give us a rating. That's how we build an audience. And why not subscribe to Canada's National Observer? That way you won't miss a thing.